All right. Well, thanks for that very nice introduction. As Eric said, I'm based out of Grand Junction, and I serve the whole Western Slope and with CSU Extension, and my specialty is range ecology and management. So Eric asked me to give this talk today, and he set it up perfectly. I thought I would talk about, I'm calling it the top 7 exciting things about sagebrush and 1 non-exciting thing. So hopefully this will inspire a little bit of appreciation for this iconic plant as well as landscape that we inhabit here in Western Colorado. But like Eric, I perhaps did not appreciate sagebrush my entire life. I grew up about, 60 miles north of here, over the really big mountains in the Roaring Fork Valley. Don't kick me out right now. Wasn't my choice, but it was fun. But anyway, so I grew up in a neighborhood that was surrounded by sagebrush, and I didn't really like it. You know, I really wanted to build tree forts, and sagebrush is not a great plant to build a tree fort in. If you've ever tried, it's, pretty challenging even if you're short. So I remember kind of not appreciating the sagebrush and kind of begging my parents to install a water feature and some trees, which they didn't because they're smart parents. So glad they didn't do that. But I didn't quite appreciate it, and my brother and I would kind of like dig pits in the backyard instead of building tree forts. And perhaps in that way, like Eric said, when he came here, he didn't fully appreciate sagebrush. And I think a lot of us, as we drive through Western Colorado, just kind of drive past this shrub and we're like, I'd rather see some aspen trees or whatever it is. But I think sagebrush really is exciting, and hopefully I'll highlight some things that I really have come to appreciate and have given me a sense of wonder about it. So first of all, I'm in the title of my presentation, ecosystem was a word that was in there. And I think ecosystem is one of those words where we hear it a lot, and so it's easy to just be like, I don't know what that means. Hopefully no one will ask me. But ecosystem is really about relationship, and it's about interaction. So it's about interaction of different species with each other, like plants, how they interact with other plants and insects, and also plants and animals. And then it's also about interaction with non-living parts of the ecosystem. So soils, even though there are living things in soils, but soils, climate, geology, those types of things. So I'll be talking today about ecosystem, and that means interactions among this sagebrush plant and the other plants, as well as other insects, animals, those types of things. So when I started my job with CSU Extension, I actually worked for the Werner College of Natural Resources. And I remember talking to someone about sagebrush, and they said to me, well, sagebrush really can't be that different, can it? And actually, it can be. There's about 20 species of sagebrush in Colorado. There's more than that, but sometimes they hybridize. So we'll just say greater than 20 species of sagebrush in Colorado. There's a lot of different species here in the Gunnison Basin as well, as you change in elevation, change in soil type, things like that. And then sagebrush behaves differently depending on where you are. So some of you might be like, behaves, it's a plant, how can a plant behave? What I'm talking about is the way that plants respond, specifically the way that sagebrush ecosystems respond to things like fire or management definitely varies, and it depends on where that ecosystem is and what the dominant factors are influencing it. So for example, I've worked a lot in northwestern Colorado, and the dominant sagebrush type up there is Wyoming big sagebrush. It is pictured, whoops, where's my light? Okay. This is awkward, but it's there. Oh, we got it. Okay, so Wyoming big sagebrush here. And I've visited places in here that have experienced fire in this particular area, and the burn scars are 70 years old. So in that part of the world, northwestern Colorado, Moffat County, some of the sagebrush varieties really don't recover that well in response to fire. It takes a very long time. Think about that, 70 years. And the fires tend to be pretty big in that area. We also have areas, Marcella mentioned this, but another concern for sagebrush in a different in sagebrush ecosystems that grow at higher elevations, maybe a little bit wetter, is the lack of fire. So we've experienced in the western US what people call invasion by pinyon or juniper trees. So when the fire cycle has been disturbed, we've suppressed fires, sometimes those trees come into sagebrush ecosystems, and that can be a big detriment to the habitat and also to sage grouse. So just a walkthrough of some of the different sagebrush ecosystems. This is in California Park, which is in Routt County, and this is three-tip sagebrush. This is also probably Wyoming big sagebrush in western Moffat County. And this is in Grand Junction, or outside of Grand Junction, in Colorado National Monument, and it's basin big sagebrush. And that type, people might be familiar. This is the type you could actually probably build a tree fort in if you're really committed. It can be above your head, and it occurs kind of in drainages. So all sagebrush is not the same. Lots of species, and there's differences in behavior in the ecosystems. Okay, number 2. Over 700 species of insects, mammals, reptiles call the sagebrush home. Obviously, in this area, Gunnison sage grouse is a important species and a species that receives a lot of attention and that depends on sage grouse throughout its life cycle. We'll hear more about that. But you also have other things, 232 estimated taxa of insects, as well as ungulates, so antelope, deer, and elk at certain times of year. Well, I'm focusing on sagebrush, but there's a lot to the sagebrush ecosystem, including other plants. So I thought I would just talk briefly about 3 or a couple different groups. So we have forbs in the sagebrush ecosystem. Those are pretty much non-woody plants that are not grasses. So people who aren't rangeland ecologists call those flowers. This is a picture of the mariposa lily, or the sago lily, which is beautiful. There was quite a bloom of this past spring. Another forb that occurs, and maybe some of you know this, is wild onions. There's a variety of wild onions that grow in sagebrush ecosystems, and when I became a rangeland ecologist, I realized that was the smell of kind of playing in the backyard, was that smell of wild onions. But I hadn't known what it was as a child. There's a variety of grasses that are a really important part of sagebrush ecosystems. They prevent erosion, obviously, between shrubs, and they're also a really important source of forage for livestock grazing and other types of grazing. And there's a lot of different species of grasses. There's also different shrubs and trees that co-occur with sagebrush. So that's rabbit brush up there, and there's other things like bitter brush that occur with sagebrush. But lots of different plants besides just sagebrush in a sagebrush ecosystem. All right, so something that I think is the coolest about sagebrush, one of the coolest things about sagebrush, is how it avoids being eaten. So if something wants to eat me, I can run away or I can defend myself. Plants cannot run away, as is obvious. But so how do they protect themselves in a world where lots of things want to eat them? I'm going to delve into this a little bit, and I also want to acknowledge there's an expert on this sitting in the room who is not me, but Marcella Tarantino did her master's work on this theme, and she's a great resource and someone who's here locally. But it's just so cool, so I'm going to talk about it. All right, so sagebrush wages chemical warfare. As I mentioned, sagebrush has to protect itself in some way from being eaten because it can't run away from things that want to eat it. Lots of things want to eat sagebrush and other plants on rangelands. Sagebrush is actually high in protein, but it also has compounds that make it really bad tasting and toxic, and so things are aware of that and don't like to eat it as much. It decreases, those toxins and compounds decrease the palatability of sagebrush. So there was a study in the 90s, this one in particular, that the researchers pulled insects off sagebrush leaves, and then they wrapped those leaves of those plants, or those plants, in plastic, so the insects were no longer able to forage on the sagebrush plant. And then they compared the compounds in the leaves of plants where insects had been removed to plants where no insects had been removed. They were just normal sagebrush. And they looked at the compounds in the leaves between those two plants. Or, well, there's more than two, but in the plants, between the treatment and the control. And what they found is that sagebrush, when the insects had been removed, the toxins decreased, and the chemical compounds that make sagebrush unpalatable decreased. So there was kind of a response from the sagebrush to its environment, which I thought was pretty exciting. The plant isn't just standing there doing nothing, it's adapting to current conditions. Building on this, sagebrush can talk. I don't mean verbally, although, maybe someday we'll find out it can, but it can signal other sagebrush to adapt a behavioral response, which I think is pretty exciting. So this, how this occurs is if you've ever been in sagebrush or perhaps tripped over sagebrush, you probably smell that camphor smell that we associate with sagebrush. And that is a volatile chemical that actually signals other plants, signals other sagebrush plants. So when a sagebrush plant is bitten, or we call it browsed, by an herbivore or insects eat it, that encourages that plant to increase its compound production of those toxic or unpalatable compounds, and that goes into the air. And scientists have found that other sagebrush receive that signal, and then they start in turn generating more undesirable compounds in their leaves that discourage animals from eating them. So let that sink in for a moment. When I read that, I thought I had wandered onto a dark corner of the internet where I was reading pseudoscience, because that's pretty crazy. Plants can talk to each other. But it is actually true, and there's been a lot of work on this. And in fact, sagebrush is a model species for this particular interaction of plants interacting with each other. All right. Sagebrush glows in the dark. And again, Marcella Tarantino has a really cool box you can look at if you're interested in learning more. So these might not look that different from each other, but this kind of is a higher or more intense blue color compared to this. And what is that reflecting? Well, it's reflecting that ratio of palatability, so protein to compounds that are not as palatable. And palatability of sagebrush varies among species of sagebrush, and it also varies according to the time of the year. So researchers have found that certain species of sagebrush have a higher UV intensity, indicating that they're more palatable compared to other species of sagebrush. They've also found that during the winter, generally, sagebrush are more palatable, which kind of makes sense because there are typically less insects during the winter. Where this gets really cool in my world is that it contributes to how animals forage on sagebrush. So actually, some of Marcella's research, she tracked how sage grouse use different plants, and she found that sage grouse were selecting for more palatable sagebrush subspecies. So they were actually kind of seeing the nutrients in the landscape, which is really cool. So next time you think sage grouse are dumb, I don't know if you'd ever think that, but if you do, they can do a lot of things that we can't do. So I think that's pretty interesting. So you may be wondering, okay, so sagebrush has these toxic compounds, so how does it support life for sage grouse? Short answer, sage grouse have some pretty special digestive systems that enable them to benefit from the protein that is in sagebrush, but I think the next speaker will also potentially touch on this. Or maybe he won't, but basically specialized digestive systems that allow them to thrive. So we're down to the last fact here, and this is the non-exciting part. non-exciting thing about sagebrush that I mentioned at the beginning. So sagebrush ecosystems are much easier to destroy than they are to restore. We kind of do know how to destroy them. I would say the technology and knowledge on how to restore sagebrush ecosystems is still in its infancy. So if possible, I think it's great to avoid destroying sagebrush ecosystems. Some of the threats that these ecosystems currently face, fragmentation is a big one. I'm sure that this is, well, actually there's a paper on this from the Gunnison Basin, but sage grouse really do need intact lands that are not divided up by roads and subdivisions, so fragmentation can be detrimental to sage grouse. Climate change is a factor that impacts sagebrush ecosystems. And along with that, invasive species. We have this great booth on cheatgrass over there, and cheatgrass certainly is a big issue. One of the reasons cheatgrass is a big issue is because it can change the return interval of fire, we call it, so the frequency of fire on the landscape. And I mentioned earlier, some species of sagebrush are really sensitive to fire, and they don't return after a fire. Specifically, Wyoming big sage, well, they do, but it takes a very long time. So frequent fire can be really destructive to the presence of sagebrush on the landscape. And then finally, changes in disturbance regimes. So that's kind of what I mentioned earlier. Not one size fits all for sagebrush. It's not, even though it's all under the umbrella of sagebrush plants, not all sagebrush ecosystems are the same. And when you disrupt, or when we disrupt the disturbance regime, that can have detrimental effects, such as encroachment from tree species. So, easier to destroy than it is to restore. But despite that semi-bad news that I just shared, sagebrush is an acquired taste, as writes Wallace Stegner, who's an American author. And I hope that through your experience in the Gunnison Basin, and perhaps even with some of the things I've shared today, you've acquired the taste, and if not, maybe just gained a little more appreciation for the landscapes that we inhabit here on the Western Slope. So thanks very much, and I will take questions now, or do I have time for questions? Okay, one question, if anyone has it. All right. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the question was, how rapidly does sagebrush respond to a threat? You know, how rapidly after herbivore removal or after being browsed does the sagebrush respond? And actually, I kind of forget. Marcella, do you remember? Sorry to put you on the spot, but I think you know this.
So it does take a little bit of time because they do have to go through a whole genetic process of upregulating the production of certain enzymes, essentially, that then produce all of those compounds. But that does, even though I said it takes time, it's actually pretty short, so it can be within 24 hours. So it is really meant for like having herds of herbivores that are coming through, so those plants need to be able to communicate quickly enough that they can decrease the amount of herbivory on their neighbors. So it's relatively quick, considering the amount of biomolecular processes that it's going through. And another kind of cool note about it is that the more closely related the plants are, the easier their communication is with one another. So if they're plants from far away that aren't closely related genetically, as far as being totally different species, then they don't communicate as well as plants that are like pollinated from the same mother plant. So kind of cool.
Can you say younger too?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I think younger plants are more receptive to the signal as well. So, all right. Thanks.